consequences and challenges for them. For a single mother, it may mean that now she isn't able to put away for that child's college fund as much as she would like to. Or it may mean that a senior citizen has to choose between medication or paying the telephone bill. The panels have been quite lively and informative thus far, and I hope we can continue the engagement moving forward. I also would like to remind each and every one of you that we have QR codes there at the back of the room where you can provide your feedback on the panels thus far. Just scan the QR code and follow the directions, and your input, of course, is very important, and that engagement is going to outline the actions going forward for the minister and her team. So this afternoon, we will now focus on healthcare, housing, and utilities. Please help me as we welcome to the stage Mr. Robin Ryanson-Parent-Chief, a lawyer, strategist, and public policy advisor, who will moderate our next panel entitled Modernizing Utilities, Addressing Energy Cost, Infrastructure Gaps, and Innovation. Our panelist for this afternoon's session is Mr. Adrian Deal, Director for the Department of Energy, Government of Bermuda, Dr. Jeff Stainer, Director, Energy Transition and Business Development at Belco, Mr. Richard Ambrosio, the Chief Executive for the Regulatory Authority of Bermuda, Mr. Denton Williams, CEO of BAC Group, and Mr. Athanas Smith, Project Officer at Bermuda Waterworks. As a reminder, please visit our feedback stands where you can scan the QR code to answer a short survey based on the various topics being presented today, and also access the Slido for the Q&A during the panel discussions. If the Wi-Fi is required, the details are located on your tables and in various locations around the room. So without further ado, I would like to bring up our next panel, moderated by Mr. Ryan Robinson-Parent-Chief.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on modernizing utilities, addressing energy costs, infrastructure gaps, and innovation. As you've just heard from Shamari, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts who bring unique insights from across government, regulation, industry, and engineering. So this particular session explores how Bermuda can modernize its utility sector, with a particular focus on the urgent challenges of high energy and utility costs, infrastructure, and the need for greater innovation and resilience. We're going to examine the regulatory and policy frameworks, discuss ownership and pricing models, and how to strike the right balance between affordability, sustainability, and long-term energy and other utility security. The discussion will cover a little bit about some of the rates, the impact of prices, and the role of government and regulators in enabling renewable energy adoption, as well as other utilities. We will also explore the growing demand for reliable, equitable utility services and assess how potentially public-private partnerships can help modernize and future-proof Bermuda's utility landscape. So to make the most of our time, I've broken this conversation into 4 segments. Each segment is based on major themes that were raised in recent stakeholder engagements and some of the early discussions that we had as panelists leading up to this summit. And we'll spend about 6 or 7 minutes on each segment so that we can allow some time at the end for Q&A. This conversation will be open and dynamic, and we'll rotate some of our responses so that everyone has a chance to weigh in. And I appreciate that we won't be able to cover everything. This is a controversial and technical subject. We won't get there in just 35 minutes, and so the panelists and I will aim to focus on the strategic discussion and some forward-thinking ideas rather than material that's already available online or in other educational avenues. And so the goal here is to leave with some real food for thought. and I'll step in where needed to guide us. So panelists don't take it personally, of course, if I need to gently move us along. Audience members will open the floor towards the end of the session, and you can use the code, and I'll pose a few pulse questions for you as well as we close. So with that, let's get started with our first segment, setting the stage, utilities as a basic essential need. So let's begin by grounding ourselves in the current reality. We recognize that in today's day and age, utilities like electricity, water, telecoms are essential basic needs just to be a part of modern society. And when we look at today's system, it's worth asking the question, what is the actual state of our utility sector right now? And so before we dive into some of the specific topics and the technical aspects like costs, structures, or regulation, I'd like to give some of our experts a brief chance to offer their view on the lay of the land. And so in one or two sentences, and we'll start with you, Richard, what do you see as, let's say, the key challenges and opportunities or tensions shaping Bermuda's utilities landscape today? Give us a bit of the lay of the land, and does the current approach ensure equitable, reliable access for now and into the future? What are your thoughts?
Thank you for that, and thank you, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Very briefly, I want to talk about the Regulatory Compact, which is the essence of the Electricity Act here in Bermuda. The scheme is already designed to put some downward pressure on prices. BELCO, as the principal utility, of course, will have certain access and service obligations and will not be subject to monopoly pricing, for example. But in exchange, they are entitled to recover prudently incurred costs as well as a fair rate of return on their investment. So that's one of the tensions that we see. And another tension that I also want to throw out there is the idea of intertemporal fairness, is we have to think about the users of today, but we also have to think about the users of tomorrow. And that's one of the key tensions that we as the regulator, and I'm sure BELCO may say the same thing, but I won't speak for them. Those are the two tensions that we have in the context of encouraging investment so that we can ensure a stable system for tomorrow.
Thank you for that explanation about the importance of balance, particularly from your role as Chief Executive of the Regulatory Authority. Adrian, as the Director of Department of Energy, what's your view on the current lay of the land?
My view is that the landscape of energy and utilities has changed from 2 decades ago to where we are now. Before, we haven't seen this much penetration of renewables. We haven't seen this much intermittency on the network. We haven't seen challenges with regards to the market forces of fuel impacting the utility and everyday users. So that has changed from where we were from back in the day. So those are some of the real challenges that we have, and those are things that we need to learn how to navigate, specifically around looking at various different models and looking at different pricing mechanisms and how those can be able to help us to navigate throughout this changing environment.
So the landscape is changing. Dr. Jeff from BELCO, what's your take on what you see as far as the current state?
So BELCO has been in Bermuda for 100 years and has seen this changing landscape. And to Adrian's point, renewables is coming, and we do want a more sustainable future. And we are one island, and that one island has fixed costs to generate electricity, and to fairly apportion those costs with the prudency checks and reasonableness checks with the regulator that we need to ensure BELCO operates. And we do every 2 years submit those costs. How's that go forward? If you fast forward 10 years, the new technologies that come, people not contributing to those fixed costs, we end up with a potential spiral. And that's where we need to work together to find new mechanisms, new technologies, so that we can maintain the level of reliability that Bermudians have become accustomed to.
So we need to manage that reliability and balance that in the context of Bermuda being a small island state, the rapidly changing landscape. And then, of course, the starting point of this conversation was around access and future-proofing the landscape. Does the current approach ensure equitable, reliable access for now and into the future? Denton, you're the CEO of BAC. BAC's getting into solar and other aspects of utilities, as well as NATIO's working with waterworks. What do you think around the current approach?
I think we have to keep in context that the primary purpose of the utility is to serve the community, and BELCO does a great job of that. So what we're suffering from is that we've had a declining and decoupling of energy usage versus consumers. So in 2000, roughly 11 till now, we've largely had declining electricity sales. Some of it is population-based, and increasingly it's driven by energy efficiency and solar. So those factors mean that the traditionally volumetric sales that a utility would use are not showing up. So instead of having 1 million kilowatt hour sales as an example, you now have 900,000, and you have less people paying. So as a result, it puts upward pressure on the cost, because what we don't want to have is anyone stepping back and being disincentivized from participating, because it's a tenuous thread through the utility, the investors, the regulator, and the consumers. And if you break it, disaster always follows. You don't want to incentivize BELCO to cut back, and then you don't have a robust hurricane response. You don't want to tell the regulator, don't do your job, and then we're saying, oh, the prices are out of control. We don't want the consumers so fed up to saying, I'm getting off the grid. So I don't want to forget investors. You don't want investors saying, here's the capital to invest for that future reliability and there's future customers. We need a robust system that's going to serve us now, but also serve us in the future. The grid that's built today was designed 20 years ago, and it was designed for 70,000 people.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension and different things that we'll talk about when it comes to these different tensions as the conversation continues. But I think a lot of the focus is also on BELCO, but we know that there are other utilities as well that are considered essential in this modern day and age. And I know pretty much all of the panelists here today have worked at BELCO at some point, but Naishis, you have as well, but you also work at Bermuda Waterworks. What's your view, going beyond just electricity when it comes to the lay of the land around utilities in Bermuda today, and what do we need to know?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, looking at the lay of the land, I do believe that one of the greatest challenges is the utility death spiral, and I say that because the utility being BELCO from an electricity perspective is critical, right? So essentially you need a healthy utility in order to have a healthy economy. So Bermuda Waterworks relies heavily on BELCO right now, right? So we really do. That said, some of you may have seen that we are currently in the procurement process for what looks like it's going to be over 1 megawatt of solar PV, right? So, kind of accelerating what we've spoken about being the utility death spiral. And that said, what ends up happening is you end up with a situation where you've got these high fixed costs and you've got less kilowatt hours to recover them against, right? And then you just have this perpetual issue because your rates go up and then more people defect. So we do need a healthy utility. We do need a way to ensure that people are paying for the available capacity that they need, and such that we don't have a situation where Granny Smith, who's on a fixed income and can't afford solar PV, isn't stop paying these escalating rates.
So what I'm hearing is that even when we talk about other essential utilities, be it water or telecoms, a lot of it does come back to energy, the cost of electricity, and how we find that balance. When you referred to the utility death spiral, and that's one of the things we talked about in our prep call, is essentially the situation in where persons are going off the grid or finding alternatives to BELCO, which we know may result in higher costs for those who remain on the grid. So it creates a bit of a spiral where the more persons are seeking that independence, the worse it gets for everybody else that remains. And we'll get a little bit into some of the drivers of costs here. And so moving into this next segment, thank you all for setting the scene. Let's turn into what's top of mind for most Bermudians when we talk about the cost of energy. Electricity bills are high, and while some of that is driven by global factors, there are also local dynamics at play that we don't always understand. And so I want us to unpack in this segment the real cost drivers, how rates are structured, or what do we need to understand? What are some of the structural risks that we're facing, like the so-called utility death spiral? And a few things I'd like us to touch on are, what are driving the rates? How do global fuel prices factor in? And what measures can buffer against it? Can you walk us through that, Dr. Jeff?
Certainly. So, as you said, it's a volumetric for BELCO, the amount of energy we sell. The total costs for generation for that year, we apply to the regulator, and those costs are divided by the sales. That cost, a third of that, roughly, is fuel. that we cannot control the price of, but we do mitigate by purchasing forward. Now, the other structures underneath, depreciation, et cetera, those are, you say, short-term fixed for the 2 years within the rate case. And if you look back over the last 6 years, actually that base rate, that cost that isn't subject to global prices, has remained relatively stable. And so as you look forward into the future with climbing fuel prices, then we need to look to innovative solutions, alternative fuels, ways to sort of mitigate that global volatility to try to help us reduce rate shock.
But when we talk about things like alternatives, whether that's subsidizing solar installations or supporting renewable transitions, those are being considered to help manage energy costs, but what are the potential benefits and challenges of those subsidies and alternatives to the current traditional structure?
Okay, so right now, if you buy solar on your home and you get, it's not a subsidy, but you get the feed-in tariff, that is linked to the cost of fuel. It's almost the fuel minus a little bit. And that little bit is other economic benefits, negative and positive. Because it ultimately doesn't reduce the total cost of generation, right now, solar is making it cheaper for that one person that is no longer consuming from Belco. They're actually getting their energy independence. Those other fixed costs fall into that. It all comes back to that rate structure that's set now that really allows the utility death spiral to continue as people seek that energy independence. So going into all the ins and outs of Belco's rates, we don't have time for that today, but it's really about the retail tariff methodology that we go through with the regulator every 2 years. And that's to make sure that Belco's being prudent, that we're not buying things that we don't need.
So hearing from a policy and regulatory perspective, how do we factor that in then, that death spiral, that persons switching to solar and looking at alternatives, driving up the cost for those that remain? What about you, Adrian? What do you think?
So what needs to happen is there are mechanisms in place that can address that. I mean, other jurisdictions have done this where there's a different mechanism to ensure that it's equitable for all. And that's what we need to do. We need to pull on those resources in those jurisdictions that have those mechanisms in place to see what can work for us so that we can ensure that those who do decide to go solar, that there are potentially some other mechanisms or costs that can be included in that to ensure that, that those costs are evenly spread across all of the rate base.
What are some of the other opinions on this? I mean, this is a pretty hot topic, right? There are a lot of people out there in the community that think, well, the solution is we all need to go solar, we all need to switch, we all need to get off the grid, we need to diversify. We've heard a little bit about what that means for everyone that remains on the grid. Not everybody can get solar, not everybody is in a location or has the resources to be able to do that. What are some of the perspectives from these other panelists? What is the solution? Should we be pursuing that further? Is it just one part of the puzzle? What do you think about some of these comments? Sure.
So I'll give you an example. In Barbados, you can have a small system, less than 3 kilowatts, and self-consume. That's okay because you're still using from the grid a lot. If you have a bigger than 3 kilowatt system, you actually cannot self-consume. You are part of the energy community. You're putting that solar energy back into the grid for everyone to benefit from at actually a higher feed-in tariff than Bermuda, and you then buy back. So looking at the grid on the island as one big microgrid and sharing the solar is one way around it, technically, but that's not in policy. That'll be tough to implement. It's 2 meters, there's other, but that is an example of treating Bermuda as one rather than this independent energy.
Mm-hmm. Denton, you're in the solar business, and Nacious, I know you have some experience with drivers of cost as well. Do you have any perspective on these alternatives?
I could give a multi-day lecture on this. So it's not just about what you do, it's how you do it. So if, as an example, 10% of Bermuda just goes with strictly solar systems, it will create a very volatile electricity system. Electricity by its nature is unstable, and solar adds to that. Every time a cloud comes around, that solar disappears, Belco's got to ramp up its generators, then the cloud disappears, and Belco's got to basically take them right back off just as quickly as the environment is changing. So, stable, how you configure it, you can stabilize that system, not send so much volatility, have some policy around what engagement looks like between the utility and the customer. And in more advanced frameworks, you can actually have the utility sending signals to the homeowner saying this is how I need your system to behave right now. And we can go further into distributed energy resources, but it's about how you do what you do. So you can get more renewables and deal with some of the volatility and some of the uncertainty that the utility faces, because you remember, utilities also got investors, and they see my customers disappearing. So why would I continue to spend money? But if we figure out a framework where we can implement a better how rather than just a what, just putting solar panels on isn't the answer. That's a disaster waiting to happen. Look at what happened with Spain and Portugal the other day. That was worst case scenario, lights out. Right?
So what it
So that's
sounds
we
like
need to
I'm hearing
avoid.
is we shouldn't all just be shifting off the grid and going into solar on our own independent, system. It's about finding a framework or finding a way for us to engage with each other where we view the grid as something that's shared, where we're all feeding in or participating in it in a way that doesn't have costs for the other. Those who remain, those who can't switch on, where it doesn't have a negative effect on those that are still part of that pool when it comes to the generation of electricity. So we've talked a little bit about solar, and Naishis, you have another layer of understanding when it comes to pricing as well, because you, as an engineer, have worked at BELCO. You've explored the integrated resource plan, you've explored LNG. Talk to us a little bit about your perspective when we're talking about some of these alternatives and how we get an understanding of what's driving the costs.
Yeah, sure. So we've spoken about the utility, right? And I think that the utility does have a role to play in this. I don't think that we should look to abandon the utility. It should be used as a vehicle, as a mechanism to basically help deploy the resources in an integrated manner so that it's planned, so it isn't haphazard. So for instance, when you look at all the solar that's being deployed, that would indicate that you need more battery energy storage systems on the grid to help stabilize the grid. BELCO does have the largest battery energy storage system right now in operation on the island, of course, but that's actually not for supporting renewables. That's actually for reducing the cost associated with spinning reserves. So it saves about $2 million a year plus in fuel. But that's not meant to actually help regulate the renewables, right, the intermittency of them. So that's something that needs to be looked at, reinforcing the grid with additional storage capacity. We talked about access as well, so folks that don't have access. There are other mechanisms that they've been deployed. It's probably going well over a decade now, say in Hawaii, where they have community solar. So folks that don't have access to a rooftop, they can be involved in community solar and still get the benefits of the solar PV. And then there's other iterations and programs for the utility. We'll have a program where they own the solar and they lease rooftops. So there's so many different ways to kind of cut the cake. It's just a matter of finding out what is best for Bermuda. Now, you did mention LNG. I could go down a very, very deep wormhole on this one, because I did spend about a decade actually reviewing LNG and basically doing the research and development for that. And what I could say is that, at that time, it did look very promising. I think there's still opportunity, but we have to be wary that it is a substantial capital investment in the infrastructure. So for the import terminal, the storage, regas, new pipeline to BELCO, converting the assets at BELCO as well. So whilst it still may, I believe it could still be cost effective, you are shifting more of the variable costs into fixed costs because liquefaction cost is fixed, the freight is relatively fixed for that supply chain. However, it becomes more susceptible to variations in your demand. So if you're sizing your LNG terminal for X amount of, it's $1 million dollars per BTU, whatever, millions of MMBTUs, then essentially if that demand suddenly gets chopped in half because of renewables, then suddenly your cost of LNG then will spike, right? So there's a fine balance and you have to take an integrated approach.
Thank you for that insight, and I appreciate you've probably only just scratched the surface there. But it does give a little bit more context around what's driving some of the costs and some of the things we need to explore when we talk about alternatives. Before we move on from this segment, I want you guys to just think of a few keywords that come to mind when I ask the question of what is driving the cost right now? And feel free to bounce around, but I want us to be able to move on with a bit of an understanding of what we need to research and explore more when it comes to the key cost drivers of utilities or in particular electricity.
Well, I'll jump in.
Denton, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So the biggest driver, in my opinion, is that we have a system that's built for more people than we have. And the answer isn't necessarily more people. That's the paradox. So typically, for someone to move here in this cost environment, They need to be a high net worth individual. High net worth individuals likely to have solar, likely not to contribute as much as you need. So we're probably better off with more urban development and putting more demand in the centralized area of Bermuda to put more volumetric sales in, which would stabilize the utility and help defer and reduce costs for other consumers that are already existing.
And to be more specific, when you say increasing that volume, but not necessarily a high worth, what are you referring to then?
So when I say increasing the volume, if you bring in another, say, 10 individuals to add to the population base, they may or may not contribute the equivalent of an existing 10, because they may get a new home that has solar capacity to cover its entire footprint, and they're not contributing to the grid, so they're not helping on an energy basis. They may help with freight or whatever, but on an energy basis, what I've seen is that it's highly probable they will be, if not entirely off grid, but close to it. So it's not a panacea to just add the people that are missing. So it's a bit more.
Encouraging more people to be able to purchase electric vehicles, so that's one way. But I think another cost driver is going to be the cost of fuel as well, because those are external forces which we can't control. And that fluctuation, I mean, Belco does a good job of trying to buy ahead and things like that, but still that's a challenge. And for us, we have to figure out a way how to decouple that. That's through alternative energy, renewable energy, balanced with batteries, in order for us to be not as dependent on fossil fuel, so that we'd be able to manage those costs.
Thank you. So I'm hearing volume, I'm hearing fuel, therefore need to look at some alternatives. Anything else that we want to contribute, Jeff, and then Nacious?
The cost of borrowing money to do the work, that has gone up significantly, and Belco has to borrow money to do the work and put the capital to work, and that cost has gone up.
Do you have an example?
So I don't really want to give numbers, but roughly speaking, not buying, like after COVID, interest rates were low, now they're, 6%? You can see that when you go for a mortgage. Same sort of things for Belco when we borrow money to put down big, extensive capital projects to keep up the grid. So
excellent. Cost of capital, and we're going to come back to that, talking about financing and funding, right? Nacious or Richard, any final thoughts? What comes to mind? Key cost drivers.
I think Denton and Adrian and Jeff pretty much took the words out of my mouth. I mean, volume is a very important thing. Yes, not population. Yes, also EVs, but also maybe revisiting some of the shibboleths that we've taken as key. Like the feed-in tariff, for example. We already touched upon how volume, the more people that defect from the grid, the more upward pressure is put on the prices of those that remain on the grid. And but volume is key. It gives the utility and the regulator a sufficient margin to be able to craft things like time of use tariffs, social tariffs, things of that sort that could be ways of addressing cost of living issues. But of course, those all have distributional costs in any event. And the more volume you have, the more you're able to absorb some of those distributional costs.
Thank you. Nacious?
Yeah, so I've got 2 points in there. They kind of a little bit juxtaposed. So one I do believe is volume. So I do agree that EVs is one way to actually see that volume increase, so the utilities are selling more kilowatt hours. But that does, I believe, have to be coupled with time of use to ensure that you're not driving up the ultimate peak and the utility ends up using their gas turbine expensive plant to charge electric vehicles, during the day. So I think that's where you see a combination of time of use and then also electric vehicles. I also want to say that I don't think that we've explored to the extent that we should have actually energy efficiency. So it's looking at the demand side, right? So the one way to save on the fuel bill is not to have to burn it, right? So I would say I think we really do need to do a deep dive on that. As an example, again, for the folks that can afford it the least, it's not uncommon to see an old readily, air conditioning window unit, which is horribly inefficient, in a place where people can probably afford the electricity the least. Same thing with refrigerators. I mean, you can see if you went from a low efficiency window unit to a high efficiency new unit with a higher coefficient of performance, then you can see a 50% reduction in the cost of that electricity associated with that appliance. That's something where in other jurisdictions you do see where the utilities sometimes will be through the mechanisms like a rider, so they'll charge 1 cent a kilowatt hour for these programs, and they can go out and actually do some of these installations to help drive energy efficiency. So again, using the utility as a vehicle.
Thank you, and that's some good food for thought, right? Because that's something that we can all incorporate into our daily lives, and a piece we don't talk about as much. We talk about the cost, we've talked about volume, we've talked about fuel and the need for alternatives, we've talked about the cost of capital, and Naishish, your point around efficiency and seeing what we can do on the consumer and the user side to incentivize better, more efficient use of the electricity that we do have. I want to come now to the next segment, which ties in a bit to what you spoke to, Dr. Jeff. Ownership, investment, the future of energy, and I'm conscious that we only have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to focus a little bit on shifting from cost to the bigger picture about who owns, invests in, and shapes our energy future. So, there's a widespread theory, some would say myth, that free market competition and the private sector are always the best way to deliver services. And that's based on a key assumption, however, that competition drives efficiency, innovation, and lowers prices. But Bermuda's utility landscape doesn't quite fit that model. So we're dealing with essential services like electricity, where there's not an abundance of competition, where the infrastructure is perhaps a natural monopoly, and so that logic around competition doesn't hold. I would like us to engage directly with that tension. Ownership models, financing mechanisms, cost of capital, what kind of future we're building as we seek to balance the priorities of long-term infrastructure with investments and national priorities like sustainability and fairness, the environmental impact, and then the questions around the public interest versus that of private shareholders. Denton, you had quite some thoughts on this when we talked before. Does the private model still serve Bermuda's long-term interests, and should we be exploring alternatives?
I think we should always explore alternatives. We have to think about the utility in the context of how it operates. So the utility's primary role is to provide a financial means to execute the needs of the community. It's not necessarily about wires and generators, and you can substitute any kind of utility there. So how can you get more efficient and lower cost capital, and how do you deliver that need, which is, in this case, electricity and reliability? So there are other models that are similar to where we are. So Bermuda is in a largely small to declining customer base with a high fixed cost. And we're in an ownership model that has, and there's nothing wrong with it, you just had to look at alignment. There's private ownership, which is an investor-owned utility, and it has a cost of capital associated with that, which is typically 12 to 14%, and that was prior to interest rates spiking. So if you look at other models that are available, and many of them, even in the most capitalist country in the world, the United States, they have cooperatives where the community serves itself, basically. It's what a municipal insurance company is. And you pool your own resources. The ownership is not then focused on getting the return, it's more focused on getting service that's required, and Belco does a great job of that now. But your cost of capital collapses in terms of you're not looking to pay out 12 to 14% in equity, and then you've also got the debt component of the financing, right? So in Bermuda, we're blessed to have our own stock exchange. We could issue bonds, and we, as a owned company, right, by the community, we could issue bonds, and with our low interest rates that we have from banks, 3 to 4% bonds are gonna be much more attractive than savings. So we could issue corporate bonds from Belco. People would have the surety that they're not gonna run away with the money and they're gonna get paid a solid return on their investment, but it's nowhere near as expensive as getting that for Bermuda, that you're paying, that you can just pay yourself. You don't need to do that. So we can look at how we structure the organization. It has absolutely nothing to do with the people that are in the organization. It's just how you earn it, what the incentives are, and how do you finance it.
I heard I see Naish is nodding his head, but what do you think should be the objective here, and do you have any feedback based on that suggestion?
I agree. So I do think cost of capital is it's a critical component, right? So particularly as we think about some of the large-scale renewables that are being considered. So if you're talking about offshore wind, I've seen a range of $250 to $400 million, right, for an investment. So if you're looking at sort of year one, if you've got a utility cost of capital of 8%, that's $32 million, right? Like that's your cost, just like that, $32 million. So if there's a way to lower that cost of capital, or hopefully not increase that cost of capital if you're dealing purely with an overseas IPP or something like that, I think that that's critical that we get that right.
I mean, Denton, you made a pretty, what some might see as controversial suggestion there in terms of alternative ownership models, and I'm curious, what do some of the other panelists think in terms of, going beyond just the private current traditional model? We've heard cost of capital as one of the cost drivers. Do we see this as a potential solution, or Adrian, do you have any thoughts?
There's also a thought about like public-private partnership as well. Let's say government maybe having some sort of role in that. I'm definitely not a proponent of government being in operations. The one thing we do well is regulation and legislation. The one thing we don't do well is running a business. So, I mean, I would say government may be in a position that likes to be an investor or something to that effect, and also be a partner in helping, for example, in legislative or regulatory challenges and things like that. But I mean, it's got to be a mutual benefit for both, So if something like that was to be explored.
Well, I mean, Denton, you mentioned sort of cooperative or community ownership. Do you think you could break that down a little bit more so that, the audience listening understands what we mean when we talk about that alternative?
Sure, happy to do it. So one of the things to remember with traditional business is that you usually have private ownership, right? And it has to be competitive. People have a choice of where they put their money. It has to have command a certain amount of return for it to be a viable investment. The cooperative model, largely the people that are paying the rates own the business. So you're self-serving. And you set your own electricity rates. So the management presents, these are what we intend to do in the next 5 years, et cetera. And this is our investment plan, our capital investment plan. And the ratepayers approve it. The role of the RA is then diminished to just make sure that the utility is doing what it had committed to do, but it's not in the setting of rates. So immediately you fall back to the community saying, we collectively agree that this is the rate. Now, the mechanisms, there's plenty of examples out there on how to do that. But the thing is to basically, in exchange for turning it over to your community, you get a degree of independence. The pressure on profit comes down, right? Because really it's about sustaining the reliability and the future investment in the grid. So that's really what you get in that trade-off.
And when you present that possibility, to Adrian's point, you're not talking about government ownership, you're talking about sort of community ownership with perhaps government support in some way, or some sort of ownership structure which allows for the investment to exist, but not necessarily taking over the direct day-to-day management, which of course we would leave to the experts.
Yeah, I wouldn't propose any change to the internal operation. It's just the mandate.
Okay. So thank you for that suggestion. As we move from this segment, I do have a question for you, Jeff. How do we ensure that as we move toward renewables, and the whole point of this conversation around cost of capital was really looking at investment, infrastructure, how do we get the funds needed to actually transition to a more sustainable, future-proof scenario? How do we ensure that as we move towards renewables, the benefits are distributed fairly? Even, for example, when we talk about the conversation around households that can't afford to switch over, what insights do you have in terms of finding that balance of moving forward, but at the same time making sure that there's equity in the conversation?
Okay. So the integrated resource plan is a plan where we take all the weather that we can find, all the weather data that we can find, all of the costs, all of the future EV demand, solar penetration, and we make a calculated model for the future, which has in it for future generation coming through what Nature said, IPPs, independent power producers. So the future utility solar, the future wind, if that comes to fruition through the integrated resource plan, that would be an independent power producer that has a power purchase agreement. That means BELCO buy the power from them and then distribute, BELCO TDNR. Now, that is a competitive process that can have whatever ownership. The utility, BELCO could bid, or others outside. That is the way to ensure that that future renewable energy that comes on the grid is of financially viable, and also it's the best path for Bermuda. Because it's not just looking at tomorrow, it's looking at the next 20 years. So if you're trying to find a way to ensure that it's competitive and low cost, that's what the IRP does. And we're currently, right now, working with the RA on finalizing that plan and making sure that that is something that hits the sustainability goals and still maintains that reliability.
Thank you for that insight. And that brings us to sort of our final segment of the panel. We didn't really get to go too much into the conversation around the role of government and regulation and alignment, but that interestingly ties into some of the questions we have. So we'll shift to the Q&A and incorporate some of that as well. I do have some questions here for the audience as well, which I'd like to put up on screen, which we can kind of review the results of later. Based on the conversations that we've had today, we'd like to get from the audience, do you believe that the government should take a more direct role in lowering electricity and utility costs in Bermuda? We've heard from the panelists their views in terms of some of the key cost drivers. And so it'd be interesting to get your feedback, scan the code, and we can come back to what the audience thinks about this. The question being, what role should the government really take in terms of potential intervention around getting these prices down? And then we can come back to some of the questions we've gotten from the audience, and we can engage with that as well. So if we can see some of the questions that we've gotten so far. But while we wait for that to come back, shifting into that last segment, there's conversation here. One question is about nationalization of the grid. I think we've spoken a little bit to some community ownership models. Does anyone have any thoughts about nationalization?
I think I've already mentioned it. Again, government is good at regulation, legislation, and policy. What we are not good at doing is running a business. That's not what we're there for. We're there to set up the framework and the policy for, to be able to guide industry and businesses on how to operate, but operations, no. I don't think that's a place for government.
How does that factor into your suggestion, Denton?
It has to be a voluntary model, right? So we don't want to be expropriating anyone's property because that has other issues associated with it. It makes the country look unstable. We don't want to frighten away other potential investors in other sectors, et cetera. We want a voluntary process where all the parties benefit and we agree to something that works. When you nationalize it, then you run the risk of people wondering, what are they going to take from me next? So, and if they do it to them, they'll do it to me. So we don't really want that, I think, that dynamic and that shadow cast over Bermuda. It's probably a series of conversations and negotiations to get to that outcome.
Thank you for that. And I see the most upvoted question here is why by law every house has to be connected to BELCO. I'm wondering if perhaps one of the regulators can speak to that, but we also appreciate from this conversation, I think we might have some insight as to why, which is the impact of persons coming off the grid. Anything to add to that?
I think that's pretty much it. I mean, grid defection and the implications that would have for those who remain. Volume, as we've said repeatedly throughout this presentation, is very important. But and it goes back to the idea of the death spiral, which Jeff had mentioned earlier. That's more or less it.
Second question for the audience here. In light of some of the conversation, I see nationalization as a question here. We've talked a little bit about alternative options for getting access to capital and lowering the cost of capital. Should Bermuda consider alternative ownership models for utilities, such as public or cooperative ownership of electricity generation and distribution? This is really to gauge your feedback in terms of that conversation and that idea we've heard in terms of alternatives. And while our polls are coming in, I'd like to ask a question around that next segment. What role should government play in guaranteeing equitable access to essential services, particularly in sectors like electricity, water, telecoms? Because we appreciate there's a wider conversation here beyond just electricity and BELCO. We're really talking about fundamentals for life and things that we need just to engage in modern society. Nations, what do you think in terms of the role that government should have when we talk about regulation, government, and alignment with industry stakeholders?
Yeah, so I think that the structure as it stands, I do think that it is effective. So I think it is good to have that separation of government where you're setting the policies, right? Setting the policy, setting the legislation, and then having an independent regulator, which will have increasing layers of expertise and resources available. And then ultimately the utility, who will typically have the most expertise and resources available. So I do believe that the current setup and structure that we have is I think it's an effective one. Of course, there's always room for improvement in everything that we do.
Adrian, do you think that the remit should be extended or expanded to allow for more intervention or regulation around other essential sectors and utilities?
That's an interesting question. I think I would say no in one sense, that we have to allow the market to be able to find itself. We do need to provide policy signal and actually signal to them what the strategic priority is. And we need to provide that clarity to, for example, the regulatory authority or the regulatory body to ensure that they're able to follow those policy guidelines. When it comes to the utility itself, ensuring that they're allowing the utility to evolve and to innovate as opposed to just comply. That's where I think they may need more directional guidance or understanding from the government, because sometimes it's just a policy and there's a number of different policies in there, but they don't know which one to prioritize. So I think that's the role of government, to say, okay, right now we're looking at affordability, we're looking at innovation, we're looking at new technologies. These are things that we want you to focus on, as opposed to just, just taking the legislation and just abiding by those laws.
Thank you for that perspective, and I'm conscious of time, so we need to wrap up. But before we do that, just with this last question around telecoms, because I see that from the audience, there would have liked to be more discussion around some of that. We appreciate that electricity is a very complex topic, and we could spend a lot more time deep diving into this. But any perspectives in terms of when we talk about government intervention and the role of it, the essentialness of telecoms and other areas, how should we be factoring that into the conversation? And I'll give that to Richard, and then we'll wrap up.
We could probably have an entire new panel just on telecoms regulation. And I think at an abstract level, yes, telecoms can be increasingly considered to be an essential service because it really does facilitate participation in the modern economy. However, it's a completely different regulatory model, one that's characterized by quasi-competition, as opposed to energy, which is, of course, natural monopoly. So I don't disagree with the general sentiment of it being essential. It's just a shame that we didn't have enough time to really delve into the topic, because that could have taken us in all sorts of different directions.
Thank you, Richard, and we're getting the big aggressive screen here, showing that we have gone over time, but I do hope that we'll be forgiven, because I think this was a very insightful and productive conversation, and we were able to potentially push the envelope in terms of thinking outside the box around how we really address some of these issues when it comes to utilities. And so with that being said, I'd like to say thank you again to our panelists for your candor and for your perspective. And to the audience as well for engaging with what is clearly a complex but urgent topic. So what we've heard today is that modernizing Bermuda's utility sector will require bold decisions, not just about the technology and the technical aspects, but also about thinking outside the box when it comes to ownership, regulation, and our shared responsibility. And as we get up and leave the stage, we can put some of the answers to those questions we got back up on the screen. But in the meantime, thank you very much. And thanks to the Minister.
Thank you once again to our panelists. We do have some shades some glasses that were found. If they're yours, we can just meet us to the side and pick them up. Okay, no problem. And up next, we have a short video presentation from the Honorable Minister of Health, the Honorable Kim Wilson. The video title is entitled, "The Road to Healthcare Reform," and will touch on the government's plan for universal healthcare.
Imagine a mother skipping a doctor's appointment because she cannot afford the copay. Her untreated cough spirals into pneumonia, and days later, she is admitted to the hospital. Now consider a neighbor who has insurance, but not enough coverage for an essential service. Think of your elderly parent enduring a backache that they cannot afford to address, leaving them vulnerable. These are not isolated tales. They reflect everyday life for far too many residents of Bermuda. When essential healthcare services are not affordable and accessible, small and manageable symptoms can become preventable and costly emergencies. The realities of an aging population and the increasing cost of care reveal a deeper truth. Our health system needs a shift towards community-based primary care that prioritizes early intervention, wellness, and health promotion. This shift is not only cost-efficient to the health system, but also protects families from falling into financial ruin. Health is a human right for all people, regardless of their social or economic background. This is why the Ministry of Health has undertaken the multi-year journey to implement universal health coverage to build a more equitable and sustainable healthcare system. Between 2007 and 2023, the total healthcare expenditure in Bermuda increased by 76% to a steep $809 million in 2023. This places Bermuda among the highest spenders on healthcare per person in the world. Yet many underinsured and uninsured people struggle to access essential healthcare services. Moreover, each time premiums increase, more individuals who cannot afford premiums are forced to drop their insurance, thus widening the coverage gap. At its core, universal health coverage prioritizes the removal of barriers like copays and community-based primary care. The government's plan for phased implementation includes a single-payer system to streamline payments, reduce duplication, and improve efficiency. A core benefits package informed by population health data to ensure essential services meet the needs of Bermuda's residents, and private insurers offering supplemental packages providing additional coverage options for those who seek them. A more efficient health system ensures that every dollar spent translates into better health outcomes, eliminating waste, fragmentation, and inefficiencies that currently undermine the quality of care. Investing in smart healthcare solutions means better value for money and the economy as a whole. Access to affordable essential health services reduces financial strain on families, preventing the painful choices between paying for medication or covering basic necessities like groceries and utilities. A healthier population fuels economic growth, enabling people to participate fully in the workforce rather than being held back by preventable illnesses. For employers, healthier employees translates to higher levels of productivity. Equity and access is critical because poor health, even among a small segment of the population, imposes social and financial costs on everyone. This is why universal health coverage aims to leave no one behind. The Ministry of Health is steadfast in leading the necessary system changes to control the growing cost of health care while ensuring equitable access and affordability for all. Universal health coverage is not just a system reform, it is an investment in the health and wealth of Bermuda's future. Investing in community health and primary care is the path to economic stability, keeping the cost of health care manageable. While the return on this investment may not be immediate, in the long term, we can look forward to more people being covered for essential health services, fewer households forced into hardship by medical bills, and increased use of preventative and health-promoting care. More importantly, universal health coverage will narrow health disparities to lift the most vulnerable and ultimately protect us all. As the work to strengthen our health system continues, we recognize that you may have additional questions. Please visit www.healthstrategy.bm for answers to some of the common questions and stay informed about upcoming educational campaigns and opportunities to have your voice heard in the process.
So at this time, we are going to take a short break and come back at 2:40 p.m. to have our next video presentation. Thank you. 2:30, we're going to do 2:30.